Welcome to another episode. Today we're joined by Nam, who's the co-founder of Hyperlane, and we've previously had Nam on the show like twice, and we've always done conference debriefs. So this time we're going to be talking all about Hyperlane and just Hyperlane. Welcome, Nam, and thank you for doing this again.
Thanks, Arch, for having me. Excited for this.
Awesome. So you guys recently did a big airdrop. Hyperlane was like one of the most hyped airdrops of the last year. I know that airdrops are very intense, right? Like there's a lot of expectations, there's a lot of like technical work, there's a lot of investor related stuff that's going on. So how is that experience for you? And also like congratulations on that because I feel like that's a milestone moment for any company. So big props to you on pulling that off.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was definitely probably the most intense experience, I would say, of this journey with Hyperlane so far. And it's yeah, like I think the way I tell it right now is kind of like yeah, like it's the most waterfally project. Like there's like so many like moving pieces that are involved in like taking something like off like this. That like I definitely have a much bigger appreciation now for everybody who's obviously like done it before, and it's not like we're like the only ones who've ever done it, but like yeah, I definitely yeah, appreciate I think yeah, all of the team kind of like coming together to work on a project like this because I think it's such a like focused effort for like one single moment, and that took a lot from the team. But yeah, glad that I think we're able to do it and to deliver, and like yeah, like for the most part, it kind of like went off with a hitch. And well, what more could you ask for? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so how does the build up feel? Like, what do you prioritize? What do you guys work on during that like 2 week period? Because I was checking John's tweets during that time, and he was tweeting about like how little sleep he's getting. So I'm guessing like
Yes.
nobody's sleeping at that time.
Yeah, it was definitely, uh, I have an Apple Watch, he has an Aura Ring, and you can definitely like, the thing you tell is like, oh, you're not getting a lot of sleep, or oh, your sleep quality is much worse. And so yeah, definitely, I think, and then like I think literally like the day after, like I think just like at least I think he honestly, I think still had a bit worse of a time because there was still like things that you have to do after like airdrop and TGE that kind of like requires a lot of like no sleep, but certainly my sleep quality got a lot better afterwards. And so yeah, definitely I think it's both like a physical, I think, expenditure, right? Of just like yeah, like less sleep, working the weekends, but also obviously mentally because you just like again, this is like the lot like we've started talking about this like man, end of 23, I think, right? And started kind of planning for this. And so like just like seeing something that you worked on for so long actually get out there, I think that just like yeah, everybody's a bit on the edge for that. And so yeah, definitely I think it's definitely like an exciting time now to be after this. After this milestone, I think there's a lot of like yeah, really cool things that we can do now with kind of like being yeah, with the token live. But yeah, it's definitely like a big effort.
Is there like one lesson that you would take away from it, or just like advise other people who are preparing for an airdrop?
Yeah, I think the way I think of, and this is like not just airdrop, but like all the things around it. But the biggest thing that I think it's always hard to say. Oh, it's easy to say afterwards. It's hard to say before. But um, as like if you double the like size of the scope of the project, you don't actually just double the effort, right? Like you quadruple it a bit more. Like I think just like once you get to this kind of size of a project, it just becomes very hard to manage. And so I think thinking about like, hey, like what can you do in like what milestones? Like how can you kind of like do something ahead of time so that you don't have to all put it in like delivery, right? Like there was like a lot of checklists that like had to be kind of done, and then it was like because it's just such a large checklist, it's very easy to kind of miss things. And definitely the biggest lesson I have for yeah, maybe other founders or projects is to definitely like think about like, hey, how can you yeah, segment scope, cut the scope to kind of like make it easier to deliver.
I mean, now that we're talking about like your advice to founders, I want to get into the story of how you decided to be a founder. Because like your previous experience, you were working at different crypto projects, and how did you get into crypto? And then like why did you decide to build your own company? Because that honestly like it sounds cool, but it's probably one of the hardest things anyone can ever do in their life.
Yeah. I think I think unfortunately it is, and I think it actually I've only realized that more after like as time goes on because I think me and my best friend Connor we actually started a company in college. I was like super like the social network came out in 2011, like super into it. I'm from Germany, and then I went to school in the US, and then like I think like like I think college is an awesome time but also like at least I would say academically it wasn't as demanding maybe, and so I was just like, man, I'm wasting my time here. Got to start a company. That was when like the Teal Fellowship out came out and everything, and so like yeah, me, my best friend, we started a company. We like left. We went to Germany to kind of start it. Like people loved the kind of like oh college dropout like founder story. Like that was definitely like no, I guess in that hindsight now is their phenomenon, but that was also the time where I had like absolutely no clue like what to do like in hindsight, and I definitely like burned out like I think probably many people who like do a first time founder. And so I was like, look, if I ever like actually I don't know if I ever want to do this, to be honest.
Mm.
And then yeah, it was like actually a very same friend Connor, like in like 2018 after like I think I left my previous job. I was kind of looking around what to do next, and I was actually looking at crypto, and I was like, I don't know if that's it. So actually, I spent like I think 2 or 3 months. I wrote like a small little blockchain myself just to kind of be interested in it. But then, yeah, like I think he was one of the first kind of like engineers on working on Cello. And when I like, he's my best friend, so I like, oh, I owe him an interview for sure. And then like when I met the team, I was just like, yeah, super impressed by the team. And so I was like, oh, how bad can it be? Like I can always go to Google afterwards. But then that's kind of like how my path was starting with Cello, of just kind of like, yeah,
Nice.
being exposed to crypto. And yeah, definitely, man, 2018 crypto feels like so innocent now in hindsight. But that was kind of like, yeah, my path into crypto. And then to answer your question, I guess, about like yeah, being a founder, it was definitely like somewhat accidental. Like I think I was kind of like finishing up some of the projects I was working on Cello, and yeah, this kind of like interoperability became more of a kind of like more of a thing. And I think yeah, I definitely like in hindsight kind of like YOLO a little bit into it. I was kind of bored, I think, and I was like, well, sounds good. And I think in hindsight I could have been a bit more like deliberate about it, but
Mm.
it was definitely a lot of these conversations about like, like Interop is going to like power, like not power, but like it's going to be in the fabric of everything, and that was definitely very very exciting, and that's kind of like what ultimately got me into
Did you
starting
did you
Hyperlane.
expect Interop to be as big as it is today? Because it feels like Interop just touches so many different points in the ecosystem today that nobody could have predicted, right? So, what was your thinking back then? Like, did you foresee this industry being so big?
I definitely think I think of much more, and I think this will maybe be pervasive throughout this interview. But like, I definitely think of much throughout from a like product or engineering perspective, and it was very clear to me that like like you need something like you need interop basically like to make this whole thing work, right? Like we always say like either like crypto is going to reach its promise, in which case that it will have a certain amount of scale that will just not fit on like like single blockchains, or like just like developers and their imagination will always cause them to create new VMs, new blockchains, and everything. And so like you will need infrastructure to kind of like connect like all of these different state machines. And so it was clear to me that either that happens, in which case interop has to be a very big part of it,
Mm.
or honestly, this is all worthless, and then like we can go home. So it was like it had to be. I think it has to be one of those two. And like I definitely don't know that I am like the biggest like like market participant, so to speak, and I don't know like how like exactly in what shapes that will play out. But from a like purely like engineering perspective, it was clear to me that like yes, interop had to like look like this.
Mm. And then, like, one of the core themes about your messaging, like you personally and Hyperlane, has been open source, permissionless approach, right? Like, so I've always wondered why is this so important to you? Because, I mean, of course, like crypto's ethos are also the same, right? Like, we're all here because everything is open, permissionless, everyone can access DeFi. So I understand that it kind of resonates with crypto, but why does it mean so much to you personally?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You good question. I it actually reminded me of actually like in 2018, right? Like before I got into crypto, there's actually on my blog there's like a post that saying like, oh, like custody, right? Like that was to me like was the most interesting part, was that whoa, like people could do something, and like nobody could take it away from them, right? Like they could
Mm.
remember the head, they could do whatever. And I think like to me, I'm always like thinking like, okay, like, when you have something that just couldn't be done before, like that is just inherently interesting, right? And I think the thing that, yeah, like, right, like blockchains are super inefficient, like they're right, like costly, all these kind of slow. But I think the thing that you can't do, what you could do before, so the thing that you can do that you couldn't do before is, yeah, like basically like have permissionless applications, right? And I think that to me was always kind of like what fascinated me the most about crypto.
Mm.
The fascination only grew kind of like more so after time. Like in Cello, there was a lot of kind of like, we talked to a lot of like developers in obviously like more disadvantaged countries, and I was never thought about like, hey, right, like yes, if you're in the US, honestly, signing up for Stripe is like super easy, right?
Mm.
But like if you're anywhere else, like it's not that trivial, right? And there's like obviously like a lot of like the kind of like KYC, KYB burdens are just very hard for like developers in other places to be. And so just think of like all of the like creative power that we have like kind of like put under a lid because they just weren't part of the kind of traditional like infrastructure. And so I think a lot of like I think from that side, a lot of the kind of like fascination with like permissionlessness and open source,
Mm.
I think comes from that. And then I think on the I guess maybe more pure engineering side, like I think a lot of my career has been built on like open source like tooling. Like I think I like very first application was just like like other developers being very kind with like their like, open sourcing their code and like kind of like letting me learn from that. And I think that was always like a very like I think how like I'm only here because of them. And so I
Mm.
think to me just like again like there's just so much power in like sharing like how we can kind of like do interop together. Because like honestly, like I think I said this 2 or 3 months ago to my team was like, like right now you think like interop is on your timeline everywhere, but like there's so much more interop to be had, and like it's just so much easier for all of us together if we just work together on it versus like having us all to kind of like do this in our own
Yeah.
silos.
There's that meme, right? Like you get something, like everybody gets something. So this sounds like that meme
Yes,
where everybody gets interrupt.
absolutely.
Uh,
Yes.
so from that perspective, like how do you actually apply these ethos to an interop protocol, right? Because I mean, in some ways, almost every interop protocol has these properties one way or another. It's a spectrum, right? Like you apply it
Hmm.
one way or another to some extent. But you've built Hyperlane ground up from these with these properties in mind from day zero. So how does that actually change Hyperlane's design in comparison to like the other protocols? What does Hyperlane have that others might not? Because this is like core to your protocol today.
Yep. Yeah, I think when sometimes when people talk like people have very different definitions of permissionless, right? And I think that's probably like one of the core like issues where like everything like you could argue that like anything is permissionless because like once you have a smart contract on chain, like yeah, generally speaking, right, like it's kind of hard to prevent people from using that smart contract. But like when I talk about permissionless, I think the really the biggest angle I can think of is kind of like okay, like can like how hard does the team make it for me to use, like to me to use to modify to like create the thing, right?
Mm.
Um, and I think from that perspective, a lot of the like off-chain kind of like both I think actual code and tooling, but as well as the kind of culture, I think impact basically like what I would call the permissionless nature of the protocol. And so for us, it's a lot about like, hey, like yes, like you could use Hyperlane permissionlessly, but you can even like look at all of the source code. You can look at kind of like how we've changed it. You can look at our thoughts of like, hey, like how do we think about this versus that? But also, right, like we make it so that's like the how do you call it? Like I guess the transparency angle of it, right? Like you can just see everything. But then I think actively actually making it easy for people to and help people to like deploy it and operate it without you ever being involved. That's kind of like I would say that like probably the step that we are taking that nobody else is, right? Where like, hey, like we have spent a lot of our time basically like making it so that like people can deploy Hyperlane and we are not never even involved.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's I think really exciting because or like again, I think it's like it's a bet, right? Like it's a bet that like obviously people want to do that and people like care. But it's also one to probably just took a bit of time, I think, for people to realize. And I think now we're kind of in a state where, right, like we have especially folks like RAS providers like Caldera or Gelato
Mm.
who kind of see this of like, hey, right, like not only could we do this ourselves, but there's actually like they're actually helping us, right, like deploy Hyperlane onto all of the like like rollups that we are deploying, and we will have like out of the box interoperability
Mm.
without having to be dependent like on other people.
I guess that use case is perfect, right? Like the Caldera use case where it's a rollup as a service, so anyone who wants to launch a rollup with Interop out of the box can just do it permissionlessly with Hyperlane, right? So this is a use case that fits perfectly. But what are some examples you see? If Hyperlane was not permissionless, this would not have been possible, right? Have there been any sort of like stories like that?
If Hyperlane was permissionless, this would have not been. Um, So I think this is maybe like an angle that other folks say as well, but right, like if you think about it like roll-up bridges, right? Like roll-up bridges are basically like interop, and right, like if you think about like CCTP, right? Like and so the way I think about it is not that like, oh, we we do something that makes it like impossible without Hyperlane, but I think the way I think about it is like we do something that makes it much more accessible for you to do, right? Like basically like if you are Circle, yes, you can spend millions of dollars to basically build CCTP, right? And offer basically like like kind of like slippageless like transfers of Circle across the chain. And so it's not like Hyperlane like enables you to do something that like wasn't possible before, but it enables people to do something that like just like now you only need like right like one engineer doing this in the weekend to kind of like
Mm-hmm.
basically get the same thing as a like soon to be public company like does to like kind of like accomplish that kind of goal. And I think that's kind of what I meant earlier by like right like we like I expect that like interop has to be in everything, but like that won't succeed if you make everybody have to like raise millions of dollars to kind of like accomplish interop. And so I think Hyperlane is really kind of like a bet of like, hey, if we are all working together on kind of right like the same tool chain, the same code base, right? Like Gelato's like and Caldera kind of like submitting pull requests to kind of make Hyperlane better, like that allows everybody to benefit from that. And that's kind of like the key about like I would say like a permissionless interop
Mm-hmm.
protocol.
So it's like on the one hand, it's like a framework that anyone can use, and add on top of, and there's like a compounding effect basically, because somebody
Yes.
would add their own angle, somebody would add their own features, and then these features can be used by a third person, then the fourth person, and then suddenly you have this library of features, that interop related features
Yes.
that anybody can use, right? So
Exactly.
that's the whole point of doing it this way. uh,
Yes.
but then there's also like the angle of how do you manage control and quality with just being able to use something because it's like open and permissionless, right? Because there's a interop is not easy. Just because you can do
Yes.
something doesn't mean that you can do it well. So because
Yes.
it's
Absolutely.
permissionless, a lot of developers would feel like, okay, I have the tools in front of me. Let me just hook up a solution over the weekend. So how do you
Yes.
think about like maintaining quality and security in comparison to also being very easy to use so that anyone can do it?
Yes. Yeah. I think it's I feel like it's been a lot, like what, 2 years ago, right? Like everybody like said like, oh, bridges are dangerous and scary, right? And I feel like we've lost a little bit of that nature, right? Like even like now talking about it's like, oh, like permissionless, like, right? Like I think people have to definitely be aware that I think obviously like interop is like a pretty like sensitive area because yeah, obviously, fails, like there can be massive consequences to it. And so I think yeah, the question of like how do you yeah, maintain, I wouldn't call it control, but I would call it yeah, quality or
Mm.
security. I think it's definitely like a very important topic. And I guess there's kind of two ways of answering. So I guess maybe first in the micro is right. Like again, I think it's about accessibility, right? Like I think it's about making it easy to do the right thing, right? Like I think it's like honestly the reason why, right? Like again, people have been able to do interop before Hyperlane, right? And that usually looked like, oh, like custom hand rolling, kind of like your own bridge infrastructure, right? Like I think like conceptually bridge is very easy, right? Like, oh, you have some oracle that tells you about the origin chain state, and then like you mint or burn tokens based on that. But I think like actually like having kind of again the tooling and the guardrails to like actually make right like the specification of those trust assumptions, or like have a kind of like right like out of the box out of the contract to kind of make that
Mm.
easier. Like just you want to make having doing the right thing like the easy thing. And so I think again, there's a lot of things that like you could look at like interop protocols and be like, cool, like yeah, I just take the smart contracts. But so much of right like interop security is actually about right the security of the off-chain components, right? Like the validators, or like how do you even like manage contract ownership, right? Like I think the thing about interop that is honestly like very different that I think people who like mostly think about single chain applications don't realize is that a lot of contracts have to be governed over time, because if you want to add a new chain, you're adding a new trust assumption, right?
Mm.
And so you kind of have this kind of like mutability that like most applications that are cross chain like need to retain. And so then it's a question about like, hey, like right, like how do you safely govern a contract? How do you like submit the call data to that contract, right? Like how do you manage safes? How do you like authenticate signatures from that safe? And so there's a lot of, again, I would say like tooling that you want in the framework to make it easy for you. And so I think the kind of like to maybe then shift over to like the more macro view of it, like my personal kind of like guiding mental model is like Kubernetes, like right, like
Mm.
in like again the 2014s or whatever, people realized, oh, like running Docker, running stuff in the cloud is like super cool. But I think there was kind of like a fair big domination of AWS, right? Which was definitely like I would say more like proprietary services that kind of like helped businesses do this thing. And then it was really like Google like kind of like coming up with like kind of their lessons from the internal system called Borg to like create Kubernetes, to like build this kind of framework that says like, hey, we are all better off if we all work on this kind of like shared framework together. And yes, right, like some people will be able to like host it themselves, and that will just be like a lot of pain and a lot of like infrastructure. And yeah, you have to kind of think about the kind of the security of your workloads on that front.
Mm.
And so most people will want to use the kind of like hosted service that Google provides, but still like having right like yeah, Google and others be able to like work on the same thing without you as a user of Kubernetes actually being dependent on Google if you don't want to, I think is really the like only way forward where I can see us kind of being able to have kind of the best of both worlds, right? Like one where like we are not dependent on gatekeepers, which is kind of again the key part about crypto, but also having kind of like a shared tool chain to like improve things together.
So like this shared toolchain, of course, like everybody understands because everyone can contribute. It's important. But then on the other side, there's also this like notion of if something is permissionless, you have to do a lot of the work yourself, right? Like that's something that I keep seeing that comes up very often. Like it's
Yep.
permissionless, but you have to maintain a lot of your like tooling. You have to do a lot of the maintenance work, set up the validators yourself. But that's actually not true because even though it's a framework, you have a company that's running a lot of these services and like value add features, right? So maybe you can touch on that and explain like how do you one maintain the framework, but at the same time make sure that you guys are always there to uh, treat the customers as customers and not like make them do all of the work.
Yes. Yep. I would say I think the permissionless angle, right, is like, or like the way I think of like a lot of like stakeholders like of a framework, like an open source framework like this, right? It's basically either you are at the like kind of like the long tail end, right, which is basically like, hey, yeah, you want this, but like you're a small team, right? Like you don't have time to think about this. There's a managed service that does this for you, right? So like we as Apgus Works, to kind of one of the core developers working on a Hyperlane protocol, right? Like we have like you come talk to us and we will do literally everything for you, right? And that's like by far the majority of Hyperlane deployments are like done in that way, right? Like we work with you, we kind of figure out like reasonable value sets for your chain, we like connect them to each other, we we do have a CLI that helps you like deploy like our warp route token contract, but honestly we'll just do that for you as well, right? Like basically the expectation very much is like you just come talk to us, you tell us what you want, and we do everything for you. But again, like then on the other side is kind of if you are like Gelato, right, or if you are like Caldera, right, like you actually do have all of the resources yourself, and you want to be in a situation where you can offer, I think kind of like this product, right, like in a completely sovereign way. And also like there's actually like a fair number of people who believe they're in the first bucket and they want to become in the second bucket, right? Like let's say like you are like a big institution right now, right, and like you're like new to crypto, like you probably don't yet have a team that like knows how to do this, but like knowing that like, hey, like right, like you can operate it yourself eventually, right? And like it's not like, right, like, oh, we like lock you in now and you're forever stuck in the kind of the system where you have to rely on somebody else's code that isn't even open source. Like I think knowing, which is again I think the same with Kubernetes, right? Like you used to be where like, oh, once you're stuck with AWS and like use a proprietary AWS service, you're just stuck with AWS, right? Like your business now relies on AWS not checking up the prices to like extort you basically. But like if you use something like Kubernetes on top of either AWS or Google, right? Like you know that like you can always migrate away. And so I think even if like, right, like you are a like a project right now that needs Interop, and you just cannot afford to, like you said, right, to do the permissionless side and like spend a lot of infrastructure to kind of like operate it yourself, knowing that you can is very key, right? Like I think there's a few intent protocols, for example, right now that, right, like build on top of Hyperlane. And what they really appreciate about that is that like, hey, I literally can see in the docs exactly how I could run this myself if I wanted to, right? So basically if you, right, like jack up the fees too much, like I know that I can always do this myself. And I think that is a very big value prop that allows them to kind of be like, hey, I can confidently work on top of Hyperlane, build my business on top of Hyperlane, even contribute to Hyperlane, because I know that like, you know, if Nam ever becomes evil, like I can just do this myself.
So if Nam jacks up the fees, you can do your own interop stack.
Yes.
So now that you have the token, there's another way to sort of align these incentives, right? So how are you thinking about using that token in this open source framework and then
Yes.
incentivizing all of these players? Like, is there a solution for it, or just you just like let free markets do their thing and figure it out?
Yes. Yeah, I think definitely the most, I can't say most, I guess. Like one of the very exciting things about, I think, finally having this kind of like episode behind us is what we call expansion rewards, right? So basically, like, I think what we just said, right? Like I think Interop, there's going to be massive amounts of Interop, and there's going to be, many people who will use it, will contribute to it. And there's like very clear network effects that kind of like come from like I think building kind of this like Interop protocol together, right? And I think especially the apps and the users who like kind of like use or create and use applications working on top of this Interop are really the ones who make it valuable. And so expansion rewards are kind of like an explicit part of the tokenomics to basically reward people who do so, right? Like I think it's clear that, right, like if you are a big application, right, like that drives basically a lot of like volume and validation for an Interop protocol, like you are really like you're the one making it valuable to some extent. And so expansion rewards are basically this kind of like automatic way of, I think, doing what honestly like happens behind the scenes all the time, right? Which is basically like Interop protocols fighting for like, oh, like big application going cross chain, like how can we get you to do it? And then just like throw a bunch of like tokens, but there's this huge like BD cycle all like through it, right? And so if you're not one of like, if you believe like, hey, yes, I will drive a bunch of volume, but like I don't have again the BD muscle to like find those foundations and like convince them to give me a deal, like for us it was basically like, hey, like how can we kind of like protocolize this, right? Like how can we do this where again like just two developers somewhere in Vietnam can basically like build like a very cool innovative like kind of application that drives volume, and then have them and the users be automatically kind of eligible for like hyper emissions that are kind of like happening on a quarterly basis. And so that way we're hoping that basically like both, right, like again the developers that who build this kind of useful protocol, but also the developers of the applications and the users can kind of like have kind of incentive compatibility.
So do you think like because there's a token and then in crypto open source systems sort of work better because there's a better way to align incentives. Like in the Web 2 world, there's no way to do this other than the PD angle, right? Like you give out
Yes.
equity or give out grants, and that's how you incentivize people. But in crypto, you can actually do it in a permissionless way where someone just like builds on top of Hyperlane, and because they're adding real value, real traction, and you can see it on chain, they just get the token incentives naturally.
Exactly, right? Like if you are right, like again, and I think it's one of those things where like you don't have to like think about it, you don't have to spend like time
Mm.
either doing the BD or even just right like writing a contract or even like just like, oh, how do you track this? Like I think right, if you are, let's say example, an asset issuer today, right? And like you
Mm.
have like a very useful asset that people want to move across chain, right? Like you can just again like you just built on top of Hyperlane the same way like anybody has done before, and just automatically become eligible, right? Like you don't have to do anything. Just like at the end of the quarter, you and your users are able to kind of like receive those rewards. And I think that's only something that happens in crypto, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's like super cool.
Yeah, this is why crypto wins long term because like free markets, open incentives, and then everyone can just come in and do their thing and then get rewarded. There
Yes.
was another angle that I was reading about. Like the token also adds economic security, right? So I was curious, what does that actually mean
Mm-hmm.
from like an interop protocol perspective? Like how does the token add economic security to an open framework?
Yep. Yes. So there's like a lot of actually like lately especially there's like a lot of like talk about like oh like we need like standards for like verification, right? And like I think there's I think again 2 years ago I think that was a lot more top of mind for people because like bridges were burning. But like there's a lot of innovation I think that can like is and can be done with
Mm.
respect to like hey how do you know that something actually happened on the origin chain, right? And actually a lot of research, right? Like I would say for example especially in the Ethereum community that is happening is really all about like hey right like how can we basically like create better like quote unquote light clients that determine like the roll up state on the L1, right? And so I think there hasn't been that much innovation. And one thing that we are, yeah, I think like super excited about, and that we think that is underexplored, is this notion of economic security, right? Like we kind of generally, I think you wrote a lot of these kind of like seminal like posts about like, hey, like how's verification, right? Like either like clients, IBC, right, or like oh validators. And I think one thing that I think is really cool about economic security that it can do both, right? And so basically, how does it work? Like validators, right, like provide attestations over some origin chain state, and basically in Hyperlane, those signatures can actually be like fraud proven on the origin chain, right? Or like if a validator lies, it's like very
Mm.
obvious. And so you can have basically smart contracts who can like assert that like hey the validator lied and then slash something, right? And so basically economic security is the notion of like, hey, if the validator had economic stake behind the attestations, that means that like you as an application who can like use like a that attestation, basically you know that there's a cost
Yeah.
that like the validator is taking on because if they lie, right, if they lie about the message involving your application, like they basically are losing that cost. And so yeah, like with the launch of the hyper token, right, like we have kind of like started this kind of journey of like having economic security,
Mm.
both from hyper as well as from other assets in symbiotic vaults, and hopefully kind of like more security coming soon that basically like provides this kind of like level of security for people who are building on top of Hyperlane. And again, it's in permissionless in the sense that right, like any validator can basically right like put stake behind the attestation, right? Like it's again fully on chain with the symbiotic smart contracts, and then that can be used to basically provide basically provide security for messages
Mm.
from anywhere, pretty much.
Yeah, it feels like the bonded systems are making a comeback. Because like 2 years ago, that was all everyone would talk about, like how the economic security of uh, the protocol is high if the cost of corruption is high, right? But then for the next 2 years, nobody talked about it. Everyone just moved on to like validators, multi-sigs, normal, like just proof of authority maybe. And now suddenly
Yes.
like the bonded systems of the world, the reputation-based systems, the stake-based systems are sort of making a comeback in Interop.
Yeah, I think it's very the reason why I kind of said this earlier, like kind of merged the two, is because I think you either have the kind of right, like oh, like just institutions will just have multi-sigs and all that they all
Mm.
ever want, and then you have the kind of like research side of like oh, like look at all of these right, like improvements on like ZK, like clients, TEs, like right, like I think Vitalik had this like 2 of 3 aggregation model,
Yeah.
and so we really think what's very interesting about like I think economic security from validators is going to get the benefit of both, right? Like basically you can have basically like the assertion of like fraud happen through these kind of like very like complex, slow, costly kind of mechanisms, but like by default, like have the validator signatures provided by with this economic security
Mm.
basically act in a much simpler and faster fashion.
So, what are you most excited about in Interop right now? Because we've been here for the last 3, 4 years. It almost feels like we've seen a lot of different things like innovation happening, but in the last 1 year or so, there's not too many new things, right? So, what are some new things on your radar right now that you feel, okay, this is finally something new and exciting?
Yeah, yeah. I think I mentioned this earlier where I was like, oh, like I just wrote this to the team of like, hey man, I'm like I've never been this excited about kind of like what we can do. But I think it's maybe different from like I would say like the new and exciting things that like maybe other people appreciate. But I think what I think is really exciting, again for I guess Hyperlane or like Interop in a sense, is that right like today, if you are a developer, like there's a lot of things that you want to do cross chain probably, but you feel like man, this is like I have to become a cross chain developer basically,
Yeah.
right? Or if right like if you're a user, like oh I know I can conceptually do this, but like oh man, I have to now become a cross chain user, right? I have to figure out the bridges and that kind of stuff. And so I think what I think is very exciting is that like to me I view this kind of like a bit of like phase shift, right? Like basically once something becomes easy enough, then people will do that. And I think
Mhm.
right now, especially where like looks like the rise of Solana, let's say, right, it becomes even harder for developers to think about. Like there's so many developers that say that onboard onto Solana over the last probably like 6 9 months, and now they're like, oh shit, there's also a bunch of assets elsewhere, right? There's a bunch
Mhm.
of like state that I want to access from Ethereum, but like how do I even do that, right? And so I think to me, like again, it's maybe not as exciting because it's not like a feature, so to speak, but I think actually making it easier for developers to kind of like actually get to the point where like, hey, I build an application and I let Solana users, let's say, right, like access like the Morpho lending vault or something,
Yeah.
like on Ethereum. Like I think that is what I think is like, yeah, super exciting to me and something that I think is still way too hard, right? Like I think you basically need, honestly, you need to probably raise a bunch of venture funding and like, like build this kind of application to like actually get there. And like I think we need to get to a point where again, like you can build this in the weekend. And I think that's not true
Mhm.
currently. That I'm excited for being true soon.
I feel like Solana's popularity or success last cycle was probably the best thing that could have happened for Interop because one, it's not Ethereum or EVM, right? So and the other thing is like because it's not EVM, it forces Interop protocols and the teams to think out of the box, right? Like it's one thing to scale on EVM, but then as soon as you start adding like non-EVM chains, it's a whole different ballgame. So I feel like
Yes.
because Solana happened, every Interop team was like, oh shit, we need to support Solana. So we need to make our systems in a way, or like our backends, our protocols in a way that it supports EVM chains and non-EVM chains. So I'm pretty happy about
Yes.
the fact that everyone is now thinking along those lines. And I definitely agree with the fact that today it's much easier to build sort of like cross-chain, multi-chain applications. Uh, the fundamental work is done, like the foundational blocks of Interop have been laid, but now we need to work on making things easy and like focusing on adoption and like distribution of like this tech, which is interesting, but I don't know how that will play out.
Yes. Yeah, I think the point that you made right before, which I very much agree with, right, is that ultimately like I mean fragmentation is really like is very bad for most people except in our protocols, right?
Yeah.
Like the fragmentation is very good for in our protocols, but even among in our protocols, right? It's like yeah, like I think you like I think you need to have a thesis about just like how fragmented are things going to get. And I think right like if you basically thought like oh there will be a lot of EVM chains, like I think that was probably true, but not true enough, right? Like because like you said, like I think for me it's like I've been, I guess, a software engineer since the 2010s or whatever, and I have seen many developers just do things because they want to, right? Like they
Yeah.
just like creating new programming languages, they like doing new frameworks, and it's just very, very obvious to me that like we had this last year of Solana, this will again happen, right? Like, and I heard Sui is like right, like popping right now, and it's just very obvious to me that like there's going to be so much fragmentation with respect to like how things are built, and it becomes increasingly very obvious to me that like it's unfeasible for right like a single team to be able to just like
Mhm.
serve all of this, right?
Yeah.
And so again, like I think fragmentation I think is especially good, I would say, for Hyperlane because you need to have this kind of like open framework where like hey if you create your new OVM, right like you can actually like serve interop yourself, and through that process you show others how to get like interop for
Mhm.
your new VM, right? Like I think like yeah like so I think it's a lot of, I think very great examples that we have working on top of Hyperlane where like yeah like right like somebody's developing a new VM and like they are just able to do that in a way that like nothing else would be, right? Like in all other cases, it's probably involves basically the like core team or the foundation basically
Mhm.
determining, hey, yes, your new VM is cool enough that like we will spend the time to like build it for your VM, and that probably costs $1 million.
So talking about chain expansion, like how many chains do you guys support today? Last time I checked, it was like 70 or 80. I don't know, 100. What's the number today?
Yeah, I think honestly, good question, and I feel like this is obviously the kind of stuff that I should know to like be on the podcast with you. But I want to say it's like 170 or something. But yeah,
Where are these
it's large
chains
amount.
coming from? Like I can probably name 25 chains, but 170 is a crazy number.
Yes. Yeah, I think, I mean, and it's also, I just came back from Asia last month, right? And I think just like the world is so big, like, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think we have our like crypto Twitter bubble, let's say, but even like outside of bubble, right? Like, I think Asia is a whole another world that, like, yeah, like totally does, like, is not on my crypto Twitter, I guess. And so, like, yeah, there's just like so many different, like, yeah, rollup providers, chains, right? Like, I think Cosmos SDK is obviously very big, and like um, yeah, I think have like, I think probably by the time that this announcement goes out, right? That we have a native Cosmos SDK module that like Celestia will integrate now, and yeah, I think there's just again, I think sometimes I ask like, okay, like what is the right, like what is the secret that you believe that nobody else believes, right? Like I think one of my core theses is basically like humans are like creative in it, like right, and they love like creating and innovating on new things, and like what kind of like what does that inform about the world? So, like how will the world look like based on that kind of belief, and like how can you kind of like operate in that? And so that's definitely kind of like a core part of how we can think about it type of thing.
So like you're saying humans like customization, so they want to build their own chain and add their own twist to it. So we're gonna have a lot more chains.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think that it's maybe more like I think people want to create new systems. So like I want to
Yeah.
say primarily apps. Hopefully, I mean, obviously, like in crypto now, everybody's like, oh, like too much infra. But like I think it's kind of all downstream from like people have a particular view of like how things should work. And like honestly, like I'm an engineer. I'm like opinionated shit, and like I was like, I wouldn't do it that way. I wouldn't do it that way. But I've been wrong so many times, right? And like I think it's just because people just like love thinking like, hey, I believe this is a better way of creating this, and I will do it. And that's super cool. That's honestly the coolest thing about software engineering.
Okay. So just to like wrap it up on the Hyperlane specific stuff, where do you see Hyperlane 3 years from now? Like what does success look like for your team and your protocol?
Yeah, yeah. I think success looks like right, like the things that we want to see in crypto, right? Like again, permissionless application, permissionless finance. Like this will not happen on a single chain, right? Like it will happen across many chains. Like users will be right, like there will be many different communities, there will be different clusters, there will be all kinds of different things. And Interop has to kind of like tie those things together, because otherwise, like right, like it's again, I guess I don't want to go into like tariff world, but like right, like I think global economies are like amazing, and I think you need like to replicate that in crypto, like you need Interop. And so the thing that I think about again is like how do you have in a successful world of crypto where all of these things run on crypto, like how do those applications work? How does the state actually like communicate with each other? Like that has to be in our protocol. And like I think again the diversity of developers is so large that like you just need to have something like an open framework to kind of like tie all those things together. And that hopefully means that Hyperlane I think does its part to kind of like help developers kind of like to bring that world about, so that like you as application developer, you mostly have kind of like the primitives to be able to do it. You don't yourself have to basically become like I think there's still probably a few too many people who create in our protocols, and I'm hoping that like I can save them that pain, because it's definitely a pain to create one, and that's my hope for 3 years from now.
Nice. So we want more fragmentation in terms of new chains. We need like more applications, but definitely not more new interop protocols because we have enough.
I like to think so, but again, developers are creative, and maybe they will say
Somebody
like,
would be like, I
you're
can do
wrong.
this better.
Yeah,
Let me
exactly. You're
just
wrong.
whip up something.
Exactly.
Awesome. So I feel like every time we have a conversation about Hyperlane and Interop, like it's a very relaxed conversation, and I love the fact that I can be so relaxed and like ask you all of these questions. So thank you for answering all the questions very transparently. I feel like that's one of the best qualities about you, because like, every time I ask you something, I get a very honest answer, which is what I appreciate. So thanks a lot, and hopefully like next time we meet at a conference, we can also play tennis, because that's something that we still haven't done.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I think for me, I've also learned this over the last couple of weeks, as they were pretty challenging, and like being able to just get an hour of movement. I personally like love to play football, but like tennis, all these kind of things, I think are a very good balance to I think our like glued in lives on crypto, and so definitely hopefully we can play
Have you
some
been
tennis next time.
putting in the hours on the tennis court?
I have not, unfortunately. No, I think it's only now gotten nice enough, I would say, in New York to play some tennis. But like I think you will still smoke me, because I definitely I like my family plays like badminton, and so I think like tennis is close enough but I definitely don't have the I don't do any drills. So
Nice. So, like, what do you do outside of crypto these days? How are you spending your time?
yeah. Yeah, so unfortunately, I think that time window is not very large, but
Mhm.
yeah, I think I mentioned like to me, like really like football is the kind of the balancing force, which I really appreciate. And so yeah, like New York is great because you have people from all over the world, kind of like yeah coming together to play, and so that's kind of like my number one kind of hobby, I guess, in that sense.
Nice. I mean, football is one of the biggest coordination problems for me because like you have to get more than two people together. You have to
Yes.
get like 10, 12 people together. So I would love to play football as well,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
you have to get enough people. And it's a crypto
agree.
conference, so we can definitely find people. So thanks a lot. Thank you for your time. Congrats on the airdrop and the TG. It's a big milestone. So you should like really be proud of yourself because again, it's one of the biggest moments for any company. So congrats.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's also maybe one last thing I forgot to mention was that like yeah, ITTG is such a big thing that also like you can see it in every Interop protocols chart, right? Like of like
Yeah.
oh shit, like that was when there was a lot of movement, basically
Yeah.
activity. And yeah, like, I think one thing that I think I'm honestly probably like one of the most proud things about how we've done this so far is that obviously like we knew that would happen, we kind of prepared for this kind of like traffic load, and I think in the span of like I don't know, like 1 or 2 hours, we got like 30, 40K messages
Mhm.
actually all going to the same thing, Binance Smart Chain, and like our infrastructure that again is fully open source, anybody can run, like was able to like handle it. Yeah, like I think within like every message was delivered within a minute. Like there was kind of like yeah, no kind of like downtime or anything like that, and so I think yeah, there's actually a very useful. Actually, the one thing I will say like TGs are very useful like load test
Mhm.
for our protocols, so everybody should do it.
That's a good takeaway and a lesson for like other people, but not a good enough reason to actually do a TGE. Please don't launch a token.
No, 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 don't do that. Don't do that.
Awesome, awesome. Like it's always nice to chat to you. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks, Arjun.